In the autumn of 1887, in the vast wind-scoured expanse of the Dakota Territory, the sound of progress was the rhythmic thud of an axe and the high-pitched shriek of a handsaw. All across Pembina County, homesteaders were racing against the coming frost, erecting monuments to their own tenacity. Their cabins rose from the prairie floor, tall and proud, with sharp-peaked roofs designed to shed the snows they knew were coming. They were built from the plentiful cottonwood and ash that grew along the riverbeds, symbols of man's dominion over the raw land. They were, by the standards of the day, proper houses, built according to the accumulated wisdom of settlers who had pushed west from Ohio and Illinois. But on a gentle, south-facing slope a few miles west of the fledgling township of Walhalla, a different sound could be heard. It was the soft, grating scrape of a shovel against soil and stone, a sound more akin to burial than to building. While his neighbors stacked logs higher and higher, celebrating the raising of each new wall with shouts and shared bottles of whiskey, Lars Eriksson was digging. Day after day, the Norwegian immigrant, a man of few words and a placid, almost unnerving patience, worked not upward, but downward. He carved a great rectangular wound into the belly of the hill, his movements methodical and unhurried. His neighbors, men like Silas Blackwood, would rein in their horses on the nearby track, watch him for a few minutes, and ride away shaking their heads. They saw him lining the earthen cavity with heavy stones hauled from the river, then erecting a strange, squat framework of thick, debarked timbers within the hole itself. It looked less like a home and more like a mine entrance or a root cellar. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. Silas Blackwood, a man whose own two-story frame house was the grandest structure for 50 miles, voiced the community's consensus with the blunt authority of a self-made man. "That's not a house, it's a hole," he declared one afternoon at the general store, to the murmurs of agreement from the other men gathered there. "He's burying his lumber, wasting good timber on a mole's burrow. He'll be damp in the summer and entombed in the winter." The name stuck. From that day on, Lars Eriksson's project was known as Eriksson's Folly, or, more derisively, the Mole Hole. The children of the settlement would sometimes creep to the edge of the property and chant the names, their taunts carried on the same wind that Lars seemed to be trying to hide from. He never acknowledged them, continuing his quiet, relentless work. That wind, in the autumn of 1887, was a persistent nuisance. But in a few short months, on the 12th of January, 1888, it would become a monster, a sudden, cataclysmic blizzard, later to be known as the schoolhouse blizzard, for the tragedy it wrought upon unprepared children would descend upon the Great Plains with unimaginable ferocity. It would drop the temperature by 100 degrees in less than a day, burying the landscape under a tidal wave of snow driven by hurricane-force winds. In the tall, proud houses of the settlers, stoves would devour wood voraciously, only to surrender to the invasive, bone-cracking cold. But in the hole in the ground, in Eriksson's Folly, a strange and profound quiet would reign, and a single, steady warmth would hold the killing frost at bay. The laughter and mockery of the autumn would freeze on the wind, replaced by a desperate struggle for survival that would test every piece of conventional wisdom the settlers held dear. What did this quiet Norwegian understand about the unyielding physics of the prairie, about the very earth beneath his feet, that everyone else dismissed as foolish? What ancient knowledge, carried across an ocean from a land of fjords and mountains, was he embedding in the soil of the Dakota Territory? The answer was being built, shovelful by painstaking shovelful, not as a monument to defiance, but as a testament to a deeper kind of respect, a wisdom that knew the only way to conquer the prairie winter was to first surrender to the prairie itself. Lars Eriksson was a product of a different landscape, a different struggle. He had been born and raised not on the flat, open plains, but on the rugged, windswept coastline of western Norway, near the city of Bergen. There, the wind was not a seasonal visitor, but a permanent resident, a constant, salt-laden force that shaped the trees, the cliffs, and the people. Survival was not about grand gestures of conquest, but about subtle accommodations with an environment that was both beautiful and brutal. His grandfather's house, the house where Lars had spent his childhood, was not a freestanding object set against the landscape, but a part of it. It was a jordhus, an earth house, built into the side of a grassy hill, its back and side walls made of the living earth and stone of Norway itself. He remembered the feeling of that house. He remembered the profound silence within its thick walls, even as a winter gale shrieked outside, tearing at the few exposed timbers of its facade. He remembered the gentle, radiant warmth from the central hearth that seemed to permeate the very stones, a warmth that never felt dry or scorching, but was as constant and comforting as a sleeping parent's breath. The roof was not of shingle or slate, but of living sod, thick with moss and wildflowers in the summer, a heavy insulating blanket of white in the winter. His grandfather told him that they did not heat the house so much as they kept the winter out. "The mountain lends us its strength," the old man would say, gesturing to the earthen wall. "And the earth lends us its warmth. Why build 4 walls when you already have 2? When Lars immigrated to America, he first found work in the burgeoning city of Chicago. For 2 years, he labored in the massive meatpacking district, not on the killing floors, but in the construction of the vast ice houses that lined the Chicago River. It was here that he received a practical, industrial education in the principles of insulation. He learned how sawdust, packed 12 inches thick between double-planked walls, could keep thousands of tons of river ice frozen solid through the sweltering heat of a Midwest summer. He saw with his own eyes how a buffer of trapped, unmoving air and organic matter could defy the seasons. He learned that the enemy was not simply heat or cold, but the movement of air that carried that temperature with it. Still air, he realized, was the secret. It was the principle behind the wool of a sheep, the down of a goose, and the thick walls of an ice house. After saving enough money, he filed a claim in the Dakota Territory, drawn by the promise of land and the clean, open sky. But as he stood on his purchased plot, the relentless wind pressing against him, he felt a familiar challenge. This wind was different from the sea gales of Norway, drier, colder, and somehow emptier, but its power was the same. He saw his neighbors building their tall, thin-walled cabins, and he saw the ice houses of Chicago. He saw structures designed to leak heat at every seam, built by men who believed the only solution to cold was a bigger fire. On one of his first trips to the river for water, he met Chayton, an elderly Lakota man who had refused to be moved to the reservation and who lived a traditional life in a small camp a few miles away. Lars, ever the quiet observer, shared a bit of his dried fish and sat with the man in silence for a time. Eventually, Lars asked, using a mix of gestures and the few English words they shared, how Chayton's people survived the terrible winters. Chayton pointed to a depression in the earth, the remnant of an old winter lodge. He patted the ground. He made a circle with his hands, then flattened his palm over it, a gesture of stillness and protection. He spoke the word Maka, the earth. He explained, through the patient translation of a half-breed trader they met later, that the winter lodge was low, round, and covered in a thick layer of sod and earth. The prairie wind, he said, was a great beast that could tear apart anything that stood up to it, but it could not harm what it could not grab. The wind would simply flow over the lodge like water over a smooth stone. In that moment, the disparate threads of Lars's life converged. The memory of his grandfather's Yordus, the practical science of the Chicago ice houses, and the ancient wisdom of the Lakota. He understood that his neighbors were making a fundamental error. They were fighting the prairie. They saw the earth as nothing more than a foundation upon which to build their defiance. Lars saw it as a partner, a shield, a vast reservoir of stability. He knew that just a few feet below the surface, beneath the frost line, the earth maintained a nearly constant temperature year-round, cool in the summer, and, relative to the Arctic air of a Dakota winter, remarkably warm. This was the principle of the root cellar and the well. The earth was a massive battery, storing the gentle warmth of the departed summer. To bury one's house in the earth was not to be entombed, but to be embraced. It was to insulate oneself not just with wood and sod, but with the thermal mass of the entire planet. The mockery of his neighbors was born of an ignorance he felt no need to correct with words. His answer would be built of stone and timber and soil, an argument made not to the men who laughed, but to the winter that would eventually judge them all. The construction of Ericsson's Folly began in late August with the first turning of the soil. Lars chose his site with meticulous care. The southern face of a low, rolling drumlin, a hill left behind by ancient glaciers. This orientation was non-negotiable. It would shield the structure from the brutal north and northwest winds, the primary carriers of winter's fury, and it would expose the front of the dwelling to the low arc of the winter sun, maximizing what little warmth it had to offer. He did not use horses or plows for the initial excavation, preferring the precision of his own spade and wheelbarrow. He was not merely digging a hole, he was sculpting a space, ensuring the earthen walls were perfectly vertical and the floor was level. The final dimensions of the excavation were 24 feet wide and 18 feet deep, dug 9 feet into the hillside. Next came the stone. For 3 weeks, he made daily trips to the Pembina River with a stone boat, a heavy sled pulled by his placid ox. He selected flat, dense field stones, testing each with his hammer for soundness. These he laid without mortar at the base of the excavation, creating a dry stacked foundation 3 feet high that would serve as a footing for the timber and as a barrier against moisture wicking up from the deeper soil. Upon this stone base, he began to erect the timber frame. It was here that his neighbors' accusations of wastefulness seemed, to them, most justified. He used massive 10 by 10 inch posts of oak he had traded for, set 4 feet apart. The 3 buried walls, north, east, and west, were not single log walls, but a complex double wall system. He built an inner wall of thick planked timber and an outer wall of rough-hewn logs, leaving a full 12-inch gap between them. This gap, the source of much confusion and ridicule, was the heart of his design. Silas Blackwood rode over one afternoon, unable to contain his curiosity and his condescension. He watched as Lars began filling the 12-inch cavity between the timber walls, not with dirt, but with a strange mixture of dry moss he had painstakingly gathered from the woods, sawdust from a distant mill, and dried peat. "What in God's name is that for, Erickson?" Blackwood called out, dismounting from his horse. "Trying to grow mushrooms in your walls?" Lars paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at the gap, then at Silas. "Dead air," he said, his English thick with his native accent. "Air that does not move cannot carry the cold." Blackwood scoffed. "Air is air, and that rot will draw dampness and mice. You need to let a house breathe, man. A house needs high ceilings to draw the smoke and keep the air fresh." He gestured proudly in the direction of his own home, its tall profile a stark silhouette against the sky. "My ceilings are 10 feet high. A man needs room to stand tall." Lars gave a slight nod, offering no argument. He knew that the high ceilings Blackwood was so proud of were a terrible liability in winter. All the heat from a stove would rush upward into that useless volume of air, leaving the people at floor level in a perpetual chill. His own ceilings, when he framed them, would be a mere 6 feet and 10 inches from the floor, just enough for him to stand comfortably. This was not a cathedral, it was a shelter. Every cubic inch of air inside would have to be heated, and he had no intention of wasting precious firewood heating the space above his head. He continued his work, tamping the mixture of moss and sawdust into the wall cavity, creating a thick, porous blanket of insulation that would remain bone dry, protected by the double timber walls. The roof was the final act of defiance against local convention. Instead of a steeply pitched roof, Lars constructed a nearly flat one, with only a slight grade for runoff. He laid massive log beams across the structure, covered them with a double layer of waterproof birch bark he had spent weeks carefully peeling and preparing, and then began the arduous task of moving the earth he had first excavated back onto the house. He laid down a foot-thick layer of the subsoil, followed by the original prairie sod, cut into neat squares and pieced together like a living quilt. When he was finished, the house had all but vanished back into the hill. Only the south-facing front wall remained visible, a facade of stout timber with a single, well-made door and 2 large glass windows. The roof was a meadow. By late October, the prairie grasses had re-established themselves, and from the north, an approaching rider would not even know a dwelling was there until they were nearly upon it. His persistence was a source of constant conversation in the community. They saw a man working against his own interests, burying a perfectly good cabin. The strangeness of his design, his quiet refusal to explain it in terms they could understand, and his foreignness all combined to create an aura of suspicion. "It's unnatural," one woman commented to another over a fence line. "Living underground like a gopher. It ain't right for a Christian man." Lars offered only quiet rebuttals when pressed. To the concerns about dampness, he would point to his stone foundation and the slight grade of his floor. To the concerns about darkness, he would gesture to the large south-facing windows, which he had carefully calculated would catch the maximum amount of winter sunlight. He kept a small, leather-bound notebook filled with figures and sketches, calculations of sun angles, fuel consumption from his memory of Norway, and estimates of wind resistance. He was not guessing. He was engineering. But to his neighbors, it was the scribbling of a fool, a man who trusted numbers on a page over the hard-won, practical sense of the frontier. As the first snows of November began to dust the brown prairie, the community was united in its verdict. Lars Erickson was a man of profound and stubborn foolishness, and the coming winter would be his harsh, and perhaps final, teacher. The winter of 1887 began with a deceptive mildness, lulling the settlers of the Dakota Territory into a false sense of security. The holidays passed with light snows and temperatures that, while cold, were entirely manageable. But the old hands, and the Lakota who still lived nearby, watched the sky with a growing unease. They noted the unusual stillness of the air, the strange sun-bleached quality of the daylight, and the way the smoke from their chimneys hung in the air without dispersing. It was a weather breeder, a prelude. The prairie was holding its breath. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, it exhaled. The day dawned with an eerie, unseasonable warmth. The temperature rose above freezing, and a light mist coated the landscape. Children, released from their cabins by the pleasant weather, went off to their one-room schoolhouses without their heavy coats. Farmers and homesteaders, including Silas Blackwood, took the opportunity to tend to livestock in the open, confident the break in the winter weather would last. But around noon, a darkness began to gather on the northwestern horizon. It was not the bruised purple of a thunderstorm, but a solid climbing wall of gray-white, a strange and silent cloud that consumed the sky with astonishing speed. An Arctic cold front, moving at over 60 miles per hour, slammed into the warm, moist air. The temperature did not drop. It fell. In a matter of minutes, it plummeted from 34 degrees Fahrenheit to 20 below zero, and it was still falling. The rain turned to sleet, then to ice, and then to a blinding, granular snow, as fine as sand and as hard as grit, driven by a ferocious wind that shrieked like a living thing. Inside Silas Blackwood's proud two-story house, the storm's arrival was announced by a sudden, violent rattling of every window pane. A low moan grew into a deafening roar as the wind found every tiny crack and seam in the board and batten siding. The structure, which had seemed so sturdy in the calm air of autumn, now felt as fragile as a matchbox in the grip of a giant. The drafts, once minor annoyances, became icy daggers of air that sliced through the rooms. The family huddled around the cast-iron stove in the main parlor, but its heat seemed to be instantly snatched away. The 10-foot ceilings that Silas had boasted of became a curse. All the precious warmth rose into the upper gloom, leaving the family shivering at floor level. The single-pane glass windows, a mark of prosperity, became massive surfaces of heat loss. First, they frosted over with delicate fern-like patterns. Then, the frost thickened into a solid, opaque sheet of glass-thick ice, radiating a palpable cold that no amount of fire could counteract. Silas fought back with a desperate fury. He stuffed rags and newspapers into the window frames and under the doors, but the wind, with the pressure of a locomotive behind it, forced its way through. The stove, a large and modern model, demanded a constant supply of fuel. Silas had a large woodpile, but it was located 50 yards from the house, a standard and sensible distance to prevent house fires. Now, that 50 yards was an impassable Arctic wasteland. He made one trip, wrapped in every layer he owned, and barely made it back, his beard and clothes frozen solid, his lungs burning from the super-chilled air. The wood he managed to bring back was coated in ice and snow, and it sputtered and smoked in the stove, producing more choking fumes than heat. The neatly stacked cords of wood, his family's lifeline, were now buried under a rapidly growing snowdrift, each log frozen to its neighbor. The physics of failure were stark and unforgiving. The house was a sieve, bleeding heat into the storm. The high ceilings created a thermal inversion within the rooms. The exposed woodpile represented a critical failure in logistical planning. Every element of conventional, common-sense design was being systematically dismantled by the raw power of the blizzard. Meanwhile, inside the hill, there was an almost unnerving calm. The shrieking of the wind, which outside was a physical assault, was muted to a low, distant moan, a sound that seemed to come from another world. The house was not being battered by the storm. The storm was flowing over it. Lars Eriksson sat at his small wooden table, reading a book by the steady, unwavering light of a kerosene lamp. The air inside the cabin was still. There were no drafts. The thick, insulated front wall, with its moss and sawdust filling, felt cool, but not cold to the touch. The other three walls, the walls of earth, radiated a gentle, constant energy. They were not warm, but they were not freezing either. They were the temperature of the deep earth, a steady 45 degrees. The small, efficient stove in the center of the room needed only a single log every hour. Its heat was not being stolen by drafts or lost through uninsulated surfaces. Instead, it was being absorbed and radiated back by the immense thermal mass of the surrounding earth, creating an even, ambient warmth throughout the entire compact space. His fuel was not 50 yards away, but 10 feet. He had built a small, covered alcove into the excavation next to his front door, a simple lean-to sheltered by the hillside itself. His wood was bone dry and readily accessible. The cold sink entrance, a feature his neighbors had found particularly bizarre, was now proving its worth. It was a short, descending entryway with a door at both ends. To enter the cabin, one had to open the outer door, step down into the small, buffered space, close the outer door, and only then open the inner door. This simple airlock system meant that no gust of wind ever breached the main living area. No precious warm air was ever allowed to rush out into the storm. The innovation was succeeding not through a single clever trick, but through a holistic system where every component, the earthen shelter, the insulation, the passive solar orientation, the low ceilings, the protected fuel, the airlock entry, worked in concert. It was a design born not of vanity, but of a profound understanding of thermodynamics, a quiet conversation between ancestral memory and the brutal reality of the Dakota winter. As the first day of the blizzard bled into a long, terrifying night, Lars Eriksson methodically documented his success. This was not for pride, but for knowledge. He was a scientist in his own right, and his buried cabin was his laboratory. Every hour, he checked the German-made thermometer he had hung on the inner wall, far from the stove. It registered a consistent 65 degrees Fahrenheit. He tapped the barometer on the wall, noting its precipitous drop in his leather-bound ledger. Next to that, he made a small, precise entry detailing his fuel consumption, a mere handful of split logs since the storm began. The contrast with the roaring, insatiable fires he knew his neighbors must be feeding was not lost on him. He performed a simple, yet elegant, test. He lit a candle and held it near the edges of the windows and the door frame. The flame stood perfectly still, a tall, unwavering spear of light. There were no drafts. His shelter was as close to airtight as a 19th century structure could be. The silence, the stillness, the steady warmth. It was the physical manifestation of his victory over the elements, a victory achieved through cooperation rather than confrontation. By the morning of the second day, the situation in the Blackwood house had become desperate. The temperature inside the parlor, the only room they were even trying to heat, had dropped to just above freezing. Frost now coated the interior walls. Silas's wife, Mary, huddled on the floor with their 4-year-old son, Jacob, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The boy's breathing was shallow, his lips tinged with blue. They had burned through the small pile of wood Silas had managed to retrieve, and now they were breaking up furniture, first a kitchen chair, then a small table. The pieces of varnished wood burned hot and fast, producing a thick, acrid smoke that filled the house and made their eyes water. The stove, which had been their hearth and hope, was now a malevolent presence, poisoning the very air they breathed. Silas knew they were losing. The house was not a shelter. It had become a trap, a cold tomb that was slowly leaching the life from his family. In the howling darkness of the storm, a single, humiliating thought took root and grew into a certainty: the fool in the mole hole. He had to know if the mad Norwegian was even still alive. Driven by a father's terror, he made a decision. Bundling himself in the last of his dry clothes, he fought his way out the door and into the maelstrom. The world had vanished into a churning, horizontal chaos of white. He could not see more than 3 feet in front of him. He had no rope, no landmark, only a desperate sense of direction. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and searing his exposed skin. He stumbled and fell, crawling on hands and knees through drifts that were already chest-high. It was a journey of only a few hundred yards, but it was the most harrowing voyage of his life. Finally, he bumped into something solid, the exposed timber front of Lars Eriksson's cabin. He saw the faint golden glow of lamplight in the windows, an impossible beacon of warmth and life in the dead heart of the storm. He hammered on the thick wooden door with his frozen fists, his shouts swallowed by the wind. When the door opened, Silas fell inside. Collapsing into the cold sink entryway, Lars helped him through the inner door and into the main room. The shock of the transition was staggering. Silas went from a world of screaming wind and brutal, penetrating cold to one of profound silence and gentle, enveloping warmth. The air was clean and breathable. There was no smoke, no sign of struggle. A pot of stew simmered on the small stove, filling the room with a rich aroma. He looked at Lars, then around the small, cozy space, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him. He ran a bare hand along the smooth, plastered inner wall. It was not wet. It was not cold. He saw the sleeping cat curled peacefully near the hearth. He looked at the steady flame of the oil lamp. His own house was a vortex of frigid, howling air. This place was a sanctuary of perfect stillness. "How?" Silas whispered, his voice hoarse, his face a mask of ice and disbelief. "The wind! We can't even hear it!" Lars Eriksson looked at the man who had led the chorus of mockery against him, and in his eyes there was no triumph, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, sober compassion. He helped Silas out of his frozen coat and sat him down at the table. "The hill is taking the blow," Lars said simply, ladling a bowl of hot stew. "The wind does not fight the hill. It goes over." Silas looked at the low, timbered ceiling, the earthen walls, the small, efficient stove, and in that moment, the entire elegant philosophy of the design became clear to him. It was a revelation. He had built his house to stand up to the prairie, to impose his will upon it. Lars had built his house to disappear, to borrow the strength of the earth itself. Silas Blackwood, the proudest man in Pembina County, finally bowed his head, defeated not by the Norwegian, but by a wisdom he had been too arrogant to see. He explained the plight of his wife and son, and without a moment's hesitation, Lars began to prepare for a rescue. his movements as calm and methodical as they had been when he was digging the foundation. He was no longer just a builder, he was a harbor in the storm. For 2 more days, the blizzard raged. The Erickson cabin, designed for 1, became a shelter for 4. Mary and Jacob Blackwood recovered their strength and warmth in the steady, gentle heat. Silas, humbled and quiet, watched Lars with a new and profound respect. He saw the meticulous way Lars managed his stove, the careful rationing of his dry firewood, the calm, unhurried rhythm of his existence within the storm. He asked quiet, technical questions, no longer with the tone of a skeptic, but with the earnest curiosity of a student. "Why the double wall?" he asked. Lars explained the principle of trapped air, the same way a wool blanket works. "Why the low ceiling?" Lars explained the waste of heating empty space. Each answer was simple, direct, and rooted in an undeniable logic that Silas, in his newfound humility, could finally comprehend. The experience was a complete re-education. His entire understanding of what a house should be was dismantled and rebuilt in the quiet warmth of the underground cabin. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the world was transformed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun glinted off a landscape buried under mountainous drifts of snow. The silence was as profound as the storm's roar had been. The story of the Blackwoods' rescue and of the impossible warmth of Erickson's folly spread through the devastated community like a slow-burning fire. The blizzard had been a brutal audit of their survival strategies, and nearly everyone had failed. 2 families had lost members to the cold. Dozens of livestock were frozen solid. Every cabin had suffered, their inhabitants enduring days of misery and fear. Only one had not. Lars Ericsson's home had performed perfectly. The mockery of the autumn now seemed like the babbling of fools. In the weeks that followed, a steady procession of visitors made their way to the house in the hill. It was no longer Ericsson's folly. Now they called it the Earth Lodge, or the Banked House. Silas Blackwood, once the primary skeptic, was now Lars's most fervent advocate. He brought other men to see the design, explaining the principles he had learned during his confinement. "Look here," he would say, pointing to the cold sink entrance. "No wind gets in, not a breath." He would have them place their hands on the earth walls, marveling at the lack of frost. He asked to see Lars's leather-bound notebook, and Lars, without ceremony, shared it. The men, practical and pragmatic, pored over the simple sketches and calculations, the elegant logic of the design finally laid bare. They were not just seeing a strange house, they were learning a new language of survival. That summer, the sounds of construction across Pembina County were different. There was still the ring of the axe, but now there was also the steady scrape of the shovel. No one tore down their existing homes, but many began to adapt them based on Ericsson's principles. Families spent weeks banking thick walls of earth against the northern and western exposures of their cabins, creating a man-made shield against the winter wind. Several men collaborated to build sod roofs for their homes, laying down thick layers of prairie turf over their shingled roofs, adding hundreds of pounds of insulation. Silas Blackwood went further, excavating and building a stone-walled, earth-sheltered extension onto the north side of his own house to serve as a winter pantry and storm shelter. 2 new families, having heard the stories from the Great Blizzard, bypassed the conventional cabin design entirely. They consulted with Lars, and with his quiet guidance, they each constructed their own version of the Earth Lodge, adapting the design to their specific sites and family needs. The following winter was the true test of the adopted knowledge. It was a typically harsh Dakota winter, but not a catastrophic one. The results were immediate and undeniable. Families reported burning half, in some cases 60%, less firewood than they had in previous years. Their cabins were warmer, less drafty. The health of the community measurably improved. The Blackwood's young son, Jacob, who had always struggled with winter coughs, was robust and healthy. An elderly couple, the Petersons, who had nearly perished in the blizzard, survived the winter in relative comfort after their sons banked their small cabin with 3 feet of sod and earth. The innovation had been proven not just in a single, extreme event, but in the day-to-day calculus of life on the prairie. The knowledge Lars Ericsson had brought and demonstrated had become community wisdom, a shared and vital inheritance paid for by the terror of the Great Blizzard of 1888. The story of the house in the hill and its quiet, ingenious builder did not remain confined to the small community of Walhalla. Elara Vance, the local schoolteacher, had watched the entire saga unfold with the keen eye of an educated observer. She had seen the initial mockery, witnessed the quiet confidence of Lars's labor, and had heard the first-hand accounts of the rescue during the Great Storm. A prolific letter writer, she composed a long, detailed account of the events and sent it to her brother, a civil engineer working for a railroad company in Minneapolis. She described the construction of the cabin in precise detail, including sketches she had made based on her conversations with Lars and Silas. She chronicled its performance during the blizzard, contrasting it with the failures of the conventional homes. Her brother, intrigued by the practical genius of the design, shared the letter with the editor of The Emigrant's Guide, a popular bulletin distributed to homesteaders and prospective settlers. The editor, recognizing the life-saving potential of the information, published a condensed version of her account under the headline, "A Lesson from the Earth, a New Model for the Prairie Home." The article, though small, was circulated widely. It was read in land offices in Chicago and on trains heading west. While it did not spark a revolution in frontier architecture, it planted a seed. The idea of earth sheltering, of using the landscape as a building material and a shield, began to enter the consciousness of the American frontier, a piece of folk wisdom slowly gaining validation. Lars Ericsson's personal solution, born of ancient tradition and practical experience, had begun its slow journey into the historical record. What Lars Ericsson understood intuitively, and what his neighbors learned through harsh experience. Modern building science now quantifies and validates with precise terminology. His thick, sod-covered roof was an early and highly effective form of a green roof, providing immense insulating properties, what we would now call a high R value, through its sheer bulk, its moisture content, and the trapped air within the soil and root structures. The 12-inch cavity in his walls, filled with moss and sawdust, was a direct application of the principle of cavity wall insulation, a technique designed to create a thermal break and prevent heat transfer through conduction. We would say he maximized the thermal mass of his dwelling. The stone, timber, and surrounding earth acted as a massive heat sink, absorbing warmth from the stove and the winter sun, and radiating it back slowly and evenly, creating a stable and comfortable interior climate. His orientation to the south was a perfect example of passive solar design, using the sun's free energy for heating. His cold sink entry was a rudimentary but highly effective airlock, preventing infiltration and exfiltration of air, a core principle of modern energy. Efficient construction like the passive house standard. The hill itself served as a windbreak, deflecting the force of the wind and dramatically reducing the wind chill effect on the building's envelope. Ultimately, the story of Lars Eriksson's cabin is more than a historical account of a clever design. It is a parable about two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. His neighbors saw the prairie as an adversary, a flat, featureless void upon which they must impose their will, their square houses standing in stark, vertical defiance of the horizontal landscape. Theirs was a wisdom of conquest, of force against force. Lars, however, saw the prairie as a complex system of powerful forces, wind, cold, sun, to be understood and negotiated with. His wisdom was one of accommodation and respect. He did not seek to defeat the winter wind, but to step out of its way. He did not seek to generate massive amounts of heat to fight the cold, but to hoard what little heat he had with meticulous care. In a world that celebrated the grand and the defiant, his solution was humble, quiet, and nearly invisible. It was a testament to the profound power of practical knowledge, of lessons learned over generations and carried in memory, a wisdom that valued observation over assumption and resilience over pride. In the unforgiving ledger of the prairie, where the price of a mistake was often a life, Lars Eriksson had balanced the equation not with brute force, but with the quiet, unassailable arithmetic of the earth itself.